Hello and welcome back to our fifth panel of the day, which delves into the topic of housing. Now, decarbonising current housing stock is a critical part of achieving net zero by 2050. And this is reflected through the importance of the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund. Wave 2 of the fund is now closed for applications. With more than 4 million social homes in the UK, improving the energy efficiency of current housing stock, paired with the ever-increasing energy prices and the devastating effects of fuel poverty, what do social housing leaders need to prioritise when it comes to decarbonising their existing stock? With UK housing varying from region to region, a one-size-fits-all approach isn't viable or cost-effective. In this panel discussion, hear from leaders on how the public sector can take vital steps towards decarbonising housing stock and take a proactive approach on that journey to net zero by 2050. To help us navigate this topic, we have a fantastic panel for you this afternoon. We have Wayne Davies, who is Director of Asset Management at Birmingham City Council, Councillor Natasha Irons, who's Cabinet Member for Local Environment, Green Spaces and Climate Change at Merton Council, Sati Wright, who is Member Engagement Manager at Northern Housing Consortium, and as always, please do feel welcome to put your questions to our panel throughout this discussion. There's a Q&A function if you're new to the sessions today, and I'll keep an eye out and try and put as many questions as I can to them. So let's kick off. I just want to start really with a general question to get a sense of, what you do and how that relates to housing and decarbonisation in your part of the world or your speciality. Let's start with you, Wayne.
Thanks, Geeta. Well, I'm responsible for all things asset management for Birmingham City Council, so for the city housing stock. So that's everything through from obviously sustainability, decarbonisation, planned investment programmes, and of course compliance. So keeps me quite busy and lots to do. But that's the remit, and that's what we cover, or I cover at Birmingham with quite a significant team.
Lovely. Natasha, what about you?
So I'm a cabinet member in Merton, South London, and I look after everything from parks, bins, and climate change, and trying to lead on our council's ambition to be net zero by 2050. We're not a stock owning borough, so it's quite tricky for us to lead on retrofit, but we've got a number of ways we're trying to give our residents the power they need to do retrofit for themselves.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. And Sati, tell us a bit about what you do.
Yeah, so as you mentioned in your introduction, for the Northern Housing Consortium, we're a membership body for the social housing sector, and I work in the member engagement team. So in essence, it's about bringing our members, which are social housing providers, that includes housing associations, landlords and ALMOs across the northern regions, together to sort of hear from expert leaders and share good practice. And we cover all aspects of housing policy, but we've got a big drive around net zero. And as you sort of said, that challenge around sort of retrofitting homes. So supporting members with the tools and resources to do that. And I'm primarily here today to talk a little bit about sort of that important aspect of residents and tenants and how we sort of take them on that journey with us.
Brilliant, thank you. And again, as we're talking, if anything comes to mind in terms of questions, put it in the ask your question box and I'll really keep an eye out for those questions. So let's start off by talk about some of the challenges in relation to housing stock and decarbonisation. Wayne, what do you see as the challenges that you're finding? I know you're relatively new to Birmingham City in terms of the job remit, but I know that you're extremely experienced in the field.
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost for all asset managers and councils and actually social housing providers is knowing your stock. It's really, really critical that you have up-to-date, accurate data, and that's particularly with decarbonisation important for your EPC ratings and your overall stock condition. It's without that, it's very, very difficult to be, well, two things really: to invest wisely but also know where your significant prioritised investment should be. So for me, that is the key thing, is having up-to-date data that's easily accessible, and that all of your teams that are involved with asset management are able to gain access to it and extract information to be able to formulate plans.
Brilliant, thank you. Natasha, you mentioned just then that you are a non-stock owning council. So, how do you go about reaching that net zero target by 2050 in terms of housing, given that you don't own any housing?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Wayne just said the key thing is to know your stock. When you don't own any, it's very hard to do that job. So for us as a council, it's all about partnership working and working with the housing associations and the private sector that is active in the borough. So we've really supported the housing associations that are that run most of our housing stock in the bids for their funding, and help to kind of prod them and support those bids if they've needed extra help. We've also partnered with the Mayor of London to use some of his warmer home funding scheme that he has. We've become a bit of an exemplar council in ensuring that residents on lower incomes were aware of the scheme, and have encouraged them to bid for that. But not just that, we've used some of our carbon offset fund to top up funding where we thought we could get bigger gains in some of the retrofitting projects. But we've also invested in a non-profit organisation locally to support vulnerable residents through the process, because it can be quite complicated to fill in all these forms. And because we've invested in that, we've had a higher take up in Merton of the Mayor's scheme, because we've been able to see residents through that process. And one of the other critical things that we're looking at the moment is how we help the able to pay market, because it's actually quite a confusing landscape out there, where knowing where to start, and all of the funding really is not targeted towards those people. So we're seeing how we can maybe plug some of that funding gap by creating our own loan scheme and things like that for local residents who are keen to get started on retrofit. They just don't know where to, and they can't really go to a bank and ask for a big loan up front to start that investment.
Yeah, it certainly feels like awareness around retrofitting is really increasing. Sati, can you give us some kind of good practice examples? Because obviously you have, lots of different relationships that you're managing. Kind of maybe have an overview.
Yeah. So I think, just to go back off what Wayne was sort of saying about knowing your stock, I think the other side to this is knowing the customers that live in that stock as well, and how they are using their homes and how they're using the technology if we looking at retrofit. So in terms of the good practice, we embarked on a big piece of work last year at the Northern Housing Consortium, along with 5 of our landlords, on the social housing tenant climate jury. And that's really the first of its kind, really, around bringing 30 tenants together to question in front of sort of experts. So they question various different experts right across the sector, outside of the sector as well, and really asking that question in terms of how does housing go about decarbonisation and retrofitting. And the biggest part that came about that was about customers and tenants and bringing them on the journey. So this is something we need to do to people's homes. So it shouldn't be done to them, it should be done with them. So in terms of some good practice around that, is following on from that report, the recommendations that were sort of put together by the tenants themselves and led by the tenants. Good practice around that is really about, I suppose, that data side of it is about understanding the tenants that live in your properties. And I think on the backdrop of cost of living crisis, it's about understanding the motivators. So we can't just go in and saying, right, we've got this target, the government target of whatever it is, and we need to, make our homes carbon efficient by this point. That at this point in time, that means nothing for a lot of people, because at the end of the day, it's about being able to just heat their homes and be able to feed their families. So what are the motivators? So it's about understanding those motivators. And I think part of it is about changing the language we're using around decarbonisation, net zero, retrofit, whatever it is out there. And it will be, it's like, you sort of said at the beginning in your introduction, Geetha, about one size doesn't fit all. So knowing your customers and understanding what their motivators are. So that could be about a customer climate committee. A lot of them have got these customer green champions, bringing them on board, making sure that they're fully aware of what's going on in the area, what the plans are around retrofit, and using them as your champion, if you like, to really raise that awareness and the sort of that from that communication side of things as well.
Brilliant, thank you. So I've just seen a question come in. So I'm going to put this question. It's actually for you, Wayne. And Jaren, I hope I've said that right, is asking about knowing your stock. How do you organise and access data?
Access is quite an interesting one. So it's about promoting to residents the benefit of having a stock condition survey and an EPC undertaken at the time. And there's normally targeted areas where we know there are particular issues. That might be that we know the construction of the property. We know that, as Sati says, what's really important is getting resident feedback. So when tenants contact us from a particular area with similar issues, that might be damp mould, it might be fuel poverty. That's the place to engage with residents and work with them just in terms of what those solutions look like. In terms of gathering the data, at the moment, we take a very distinct, team of stock condition surveyors. It's a mixture. So sometimes we'll use internal surveyors, particularly if they're out dealing with a repairs issue or doing planned maintenance work. There's something that they might notice on the estate. And then we have a team of dedicated external consultants that come in and book appointments with residents and go and visit homes. So there's different ways of doing it. I think the key is to do it in a controlled, focused way rather than what I call the scattergun approach, because what's really important to make it easily accessible and to be able to share it with tenants and actually get your teams to be really effective, you've got to be focused and clear about where is the information coming in, what's the assessment by the surveyor. Quite often different surveyors can view a home in a different way. So, we have a back office team that then vet the data and then do further surveys if you feel there's something that doesn't look quite right. But that takes time. At best, it's a 5-year program of doing 20% of your stock each year, hopefully then achieving 100%. But, that's, the simplest thing is to make sure that you're able to collect it into an asset database that you're able to use and complement with other software services. So, Parity, who do specific EPC work, you've got to be able to convert your data and to use it elsewhere.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Wayne. I hope that helped you, Jaren. Keep those questions coming. Natasha, I wanted to ask you about the importance of partnerships, because I know you mentioned about the Mayor of London. How important is partnership working for you? And also, where is it working?
All of our climate, I think for every council, partnership working when it comes to reaching our climate goals is going to be key for us, particularly because of not owning much stock, apart from owning our own council buildings. It's crucial. Where it's working really is around helping lower income families retrofit their homes, and then around that key thing around language, as Sati was saying, it's more about how do we save you money, and this is how we're going to help you to make your home warmer, rather than us coming in and traipsing mud and dust through your house. So it's trying to kind of walk people through that process, and partnering with local trusted advocates who can make those cases to people. But then also we've got a climate action community group who go out who basically come up with different projects that they think will help to break down the barriers between the council and our residents. So we've got 4 boards, and one of them is buildings and energy. And this group have come up with a great scheme where they go into local schools and they teach a couple of modules on energy efficiency to school kids. And at the end of the term, they have an energy cafe where parents can come in and get advice on making their homes energy efficient. And we also then partner with an organisation to go in and do free energy efficiency audits of their home. And that's how we were able then to link it into the Warmer Home scheme, because we were able to have that data there. And we're hoping to roll that out across the boroughs. It's been really positive. And then I think one of the other key things we're working on at the moment is around skills and around jobs. We've got a great relationship with our local college, but also again with the Mayor's kind of Greener Skills Academy, if we are going to retrofit this borough, especially in the private sector, we're going to need a lot of people to do it. And as we plug into it, we've got a regional body that we were part of called the South London Partnership, and across the partnership, we're all pooling our resources to train the next kind of generation of people to retrofit and also fill those climate green jobs that we've got coming down the line. So it's all about doing things right now in the immediate term of, you know, making homes energy efficient, but in the long term, skilling our residents, skilling our region, and ensuring that we've got the resources we need for the future.
Yeah, great points there. And the skilling up in jobs, I noticed both Wayne and Sati were nodding. Sati, anything to add there?
Yeah, again, I mean, I think, you know, when we talk about challenges for the sector, one of the biggest things is skills and capacity. So, you know, I think that's within terms of, there was a recent event that I was at for the Homes England, and they were talking about particularly from a local authority perspective. And again, Natasha and Wayne will probably be able to say more about this coming from that local authority perspective, that there is real sort of skills and capacity gaps there and some real challenges there. And I know again from some of our other local authority members that we've been hearing from, especially some of the smaller ones that don't have their teams or don't have the stock in-house, that they're really struggling to take this agenda forward, and they're having to do that partnership working, as Natasha was sort of saying. So we did a piece of work with IPPR, which is a think tank for the Housing for North, back in 2021, I think it was. And back then they were sort of saying that, you know, there's a huge opportunity. Yes, that's a challenge in itself, but there's a huge opportunity around that skills agenda. And, you know, just for the homes for the north, in the north, and retrofitting, you know, you could employ about 77,000 people to be able to deliver on that retrofit scale, and that's sort of direct jobs. And if you look at the indirect jobs, I think it was something like over 110,000. So there is a huge opportunity, but recognizing that there's huge challenges. So I think, you know, again, as Natasha was saying, it's something about looking at something for the short term, but really building that skills base, but, you know, giving those jobs locally. And I think there is, again, some good practice across the sector of that being done, but I think it's about how do we scale that up.
Yeah, brilliant. Wayne, anything you'd like to add?
I wanted to say that this will be the next growth opportunity for careers for all people to either retrain or you know, young people coming out of you know, education. There will just be a huge shortage of people, and we're doing lots of things in terms of incentivising a retrofit academy, working with some large contractors to you know, use apprenticeships and things like that, and it's just a huge opportunity, and it will be here for 10, 15 years at least, you know, to get into being. One of the things I was going to add, and it's something that Sati said about pilot schemes and about, you know, smaller organisations who maybe haven't got the infrastructure or haven't, you know, are able to invest considerably. You know, I'd really promote, you know, partnership working with other local authorities or housing providers to see what they're doing. And to see what infrastructure they have and delivery, because that's the other thing is that, you know, we're seeing our contractor base now expanding, and of course they're overwhelmed because they're unable to keep up with the pure demand as well, for the reasons we've just mentioned about you know, supply and people availability and upskilling people. So yeah, I think that's something else that certainly is one of the things to consider.
Brilliant, thank you. And I'm just aware we've probably got about 10 minutes on this discussion left. So if you do have any questions for our panel, do pop them in that ask your question box, and I'll keep an eye on that. Sati, I'm just wondering if there are some points that you could share for the sector to bear in mind around their work on net zero and tenant engagement.
Yeah. So again, you know, obviously there's, as we've sort of covered already to some extent, there's lots of opportunity in there, lots of challenges. But I think the biggest, what we found through the project that we did and some existing work that we're ongoing with as a following from that project, is that customer engagement is really vital. Because at the end of the day, it's all and well, we're going in, we put in the retrofit, we do whatever we need to, but is it really going to make a difference to them if you haven't really engaged with them and they weren't aware of exactly what was happening? So that communication piece that Wayne was talking about earlier, I think that's absolutely vital. I think some of the key points that were coming out from the research and something that's coming through strongly from our members is a key point of contact. So right from the beginning, right through to the end and beyond, I would say as well, that there's that one per point of contact, whoever that might be, and there's there's tenant liaison officers, there's retrofit coordinators, and that will vary depending on the organisation and the scheme itself. So if there's a key point of contact, again, going back to Natasha, what she was on, that trusted person, because at the end of the day, first of all, that communication was there right from the early days to, look, we're going to be doing this, why we're going to be doing this, what you will get out of it, all of that information, then you're more likely to get more people on board. And then that continuing that relationship throughout as well. And then I think, again, Natasha picked up on this point about that trusted person. Again, it's like, we used to hear that train the trainer approach many, many years ago about if you're wanting to do something, you get the people out there that you're looking to work with, and it's going to impact more to deliver that training for you. So it's those community climate champions. So, and we're seeing that again across our membership as well. And back to my point early on, with the current landscape that we're in, which is not going to go anywhere anytime soon, and the challenges that many of our communities and residents are facing, understanding what are their motivators. You know what I mean? For us, obviously from an organisational point perspective, it's about retrofitting homes, and that obviously does equal warm, energy efficient homes, which are going to be more affordable. But what are the real motivators of your customers? What are the real motivators of your tenants? So getting to understand that and going back to that data piece that Wayne was talking about. And then I think, again, just going back to that communication, I think that is so vital, really, really vital.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Sati. I've got a question that's come through, so whoever feels they want to answer. But Keith is asking, what about acquiring new housing stock and making sure new housing is carbon zero to avoid future retrofitting? So, for those councils that are planning on acquiring new housing stock, how do you sort of stop this kind of in the future having to retrofit? Natasha, I can see you nodding there.
Yeah, so I mean, it's quite a live subject for us in Merton, because again, non-stock owning, but what we do have control over is our local plan, which is just gone in front of the inspectorate, and if we get it signed off, we're about to we're going to have some of the most stringent energy targets within our new build, so we don't have to retrofit in the future. So retrofit isn't a thing. It's going to be all around energy efficiency and heating generation and things like that on site. So we are going through that process at the moment of trying to ensure that we design out this problem so that in the future, that you start from a place of this building is energy efficient and is going to be fit for 100 years from now. And then we're also we also put some money towards hiring somebody to enforce minimum energy standards on private rental properties. We didn't have that capacity within our planning team before. Now we've got that, so that we can, again, because we're working with the private sector, we can ensure that we, where we have carrots, we can also have sticks to ensure that people are doing the right thing and making homes energy efficient. There isn't much of an incentive for landlords to make properties energy efficient because they don't live there and they don't have to worry about the bills. Unless we go in and make it their problem, it won't be. So that's what we're doing.
Brilliant. Wayne, Sati, anything you'd like to add to that?
Not from my perspective. Again, our focus has very much been on retrofit and existing homes, but I think just from what Natasha was sort of saying, it is something that some of, obviously, our members are very much aware of and putting things in place to make sure that it's done right the first time. Because again, this was a big thing that, you're going in, it's something that you shouldn't be having to go in again. And obviously, we have been doing quite a bit of work around the private renter sector, but obviously supporting our local authority members, and the sort of minimum energy standards, efficiency standards is coming up time and time again. So that's definitely something that our local authority members are really, really big on.
Geeta, I was just going to add, I mean, the challenge for all of us is that, and for many organisations, is the level of investment required for new build. So, yes, you can have some very compliant, zero carbon properties, but you might build half as many as you would do normally, and therefore you're trying to meet this challenge between supply, demand, and then building a really great standard. I think the other thing for me is that retrofit and the technology is really good technology. it's working. We can monitor, outputs, and that's really, really important. I think what Natasha said, to know that you've invested and you've made a difference. I think the real key with it all, though, is that you just have to have a balanced approach. And the one thing that you really have to have it underpinned with the tenants, residents, is an asset management strategy that sets your future goals, that's clear and that the residents have bought into and helped design. Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. And actually, Wayne, because you mentioned investments, when it comes for bidding for funding, is there one thing that could make it easier for your council or other councils to reach their target? Because we've not really spoken a lot about funding.
Yeah, I mean, this is a challenging one for all organisations, and I'm afraid to not try and not break the record, but it's back to knowing your stock. It's back to knowing where your residents, are suffering, where there's an issue, and prioritising that work. I think second to that then is the financial plan that you work alongside your requirements in terms of your investment to your stock. If you get those two to work together, then you can then start your investment programs and your delivery programs. But for me, it always comes back to know your residents, know your stock, know where you need to look, because quite often data just tells you some information. It doesn't tell you what it's like to live there, other than an overview. So you would go, you'd visit, you'd understand, talk to the residents, do consultation, find out what the best fit is for them. And then away you go. So and investment is really difficult. Do you invest in new homes? Do you invest in your old homes? Is it a mixture? One of the things that I think is really important is that some of your homes will not meet a standard, despite the amount of money that you need to invest in them. And actually, many of your residents would say, "I don't want to live there anyway." And so, therefore, acquiring the right property at a really good level from a carbon perspective is important, but also acknowledging that some of your homes will need to be sold to help the investment program. So something else to think about there in the round.
Okay, Natasha, what about from your perspective?
Well, I mean, again, non-stock owning, so we've got a slightly different look on it. We're trying to encourage our residents to retrofit. We're trying to encourage partners to retrofit, and the current funding models from government are bitty at best and are too short term. You've got kind of a couple of years at best to kind of to bid for them, and it doesn't allow you to make long-term investments, and it doesn't allow the broader industry to in terms of supply chains to invest in that tech, because they don't know if the funding's going to be there in a year or not. So it kind of stops that progress. I mean, I if I had one, it's not necessarily about us all just wanting more money. I think it's just wanting more certainty and wanting more of a holistic strategy that was a bit long term, and it wasn't just about a funding pot here and a funding pot there. I've had to get my officers to do a kind of a spreadsheet matrix for me to understand what pots of funding it is we're bidding for at any given time. And I think that work could be better spent just doing the retrofitting rather than having to kind of bid over and over again for various different pots of money.
Brilliant, thank you, Natasha. And I'm just conscious we've only got a few minutes left. Sati, your thoughts? And I don't like to end on money, but it is important. So what do you think?
Yeah, obviously it is one of the biggest challenges facing the sector. It is all about the money. Again, echoing what's already been said, but just to add to that, I think from our perspective, obviously we have been liaising with obviously BEIS and the teams there about sort of bringing that funding forward. You mentioned the SHDF, and we're expecting sort of announcements on Wave 2. I know from early indications that it's been very positive for us in the north. We had quite a few strong bids in there. Whether they were successful or not, I don't know, but that was what we were hearing back. And I think there's also an element of this thing about flexible funding, because we know that in terms of the government pot, it's not going to be available there for that long term that we wanted, that Natasha was sort of talking about. And that's the feedback we're getting from our members. But it's about what else is there out there? What else can members, the housing sector, do in terms of funding their way to net zero? And there is sort of like other approaches out there, and that partnership, it comes back down to that partnership and that collaboration and what already is working out there, and how can we work together to achieve what we need to achieve together.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Well, we have run out of time. I think we could have spoken for a lot longer, but I thank you so much to our panelists there, Wayne, Natasha and Sati. Well, it's time now for our keynote with Shane Rees, who is Head of Marketing at Chargy, to elaborate on bridging the driveway divide with lamppost charging. ZapMap estimates around 85 to 90% of electric vehicle drivers are people with a driveway. So for those without, EV charging seems difficult and expensive, for households that can't charge using their home electric supply. To solve the difficult barrier where homes lack of off-street parking, lamppost charge points have provided a viable solution to not only the residents, but for the public EV infrastructure. In December 2022, Chargy became the first public charging network to introduce low-cost overnight charging across its entire network. During this session, we'll be learning how lamppost charge points can help local authorities meet their infrastructure targets and how using overnight charging is delivering extra carbon savings. So over to you, Shane.
As Gita said, I'm Shane. I look after marketing at Chargy. Chargy is a public charge point operator. So we make our own charge points, the software that they run on, and we take care of all the maintenance. And you can see one on that picture there. We've installed well over 2,000 of those now. And they are proving a very popular way to help people who don't have driveways to make the switch and feel confident enough to make the switch to electric cars. So if we have a quick look at the next slide. This is the challenge that we're trying to face. I'm not going to teach you to suck eggs on pollution and climate change today, but I think as Simon Pope, one of the earlier speakers today, mentioned, we do need to achieve that net zero as quickly as possible, and the amount of carbon we have left in our carbon budgets is a crucial consideration. So how can we reduce carbon emissions as quickly as possible? And the more people we can get to switch to electric cars, that also has an impact on air quality. So if we look at the next slide, there's been a lot of talk about active travel and how we can encourage modal change or modal shift. So getting us to move around in ways other than cars. That's a really noble ambition and something we should be absolutely pushing towards. But I think we also have to be cognizant of how fond we are of getting around in cars. So this is some data from the Department for Transport. Every 6 months, they commission this technology tracker, which looks at our opinions towards different forms of transport. And I think the key stuff to think about here is, although we're traveling less and less in our cars, which you can see from the data in the top right hand corner, we're still very wedded to this idea of having access to a car. And nearly 9 in 10 of us have continuous access to a car, and about the same number in the last research survey have said we want to keep access to that. I think the good news out of this story is the next cars that we are looking at, more and more people are looking at electric versions, so cars with a plug. So if we look at the next slide, the thing that's what we need to achieve is how to make EVs the easy choice for more people. So roughly 40% of us won't be able to charge on our own driveway. We can make charging sort of an enabler and a benefit of going electric. As you can see there, it's one of the things that people like is when charging is easy, it actually becomes a benefit of having an EV, but it's also a massive barrier. So the number of electric vehicle charge points is something that holds people back, and the perceptions of how long it takes to charge is another thing that holds them back. So I think we need to think like Baloo and accentuate the positives and eliminate the negatives, and we can help everyone make the switch to electric cars. So if we look at the next slide, this is a way of thinking about the charging infrastructure as an ecosystem and how the different types of chargers work together. And really, the role that councils play is helping those residents who don't have off-street parking to do more of their charging at home. Because if we get that right, the more charging we do at the bottom end of that triangle, the cheaper it is for people, because we're using cheaper hardware, and we're using energy at cheaper times of day. It's much easier because you're charging where you park already, and getting on with your life. And by and large, it's also much lower carbon because we're using more power when energy demand on the grid is at its lowest. And I think, as someone said earlier this morning, it's not just about the amount of energy that we need to generate to drive our cars. It's also about when we use it, and the strain that places on the grid, because we're going to be electrifying transport, but we're also electrifying heat and other things that are going to put more stress on the wires that we rely on for our modern day lives. So let's look at the challenge that we need to address together. It's really, how do we work together as a private company and councils to make EVs easier to run? So take care of that charging, and also cheaper. So we level the playing field between people who have driveways and people who don't, so that more people can make this change quickly. So if we look at that next slide, on to what can we do to make charging easier. If we go on to the next slide, this is some research that the government did when it was putting together its EV charging infrastructure strategy that it published last year. And what they found was, if we're going to make charging easy, what we really need is hyper-local charging, so really close to people's homes. It's very noble putting charge points in car parks that might be in a town centre. Really doesn't have a driveway. And if I wasn't as committed to this, I would probably choose a combustion car rather than have that hassle of having to charge a car in ways that take up a lot of your time otherwise. So when we think about local EV charging infrastructure, we do mean local, and that's like within a minute or two's walk from your front door. And the more we can make charging work that way, the more EVs become appealing to people who don't have driveways. So if we look at the next slide, when those people who took part in the study were presented with a range of options, the one that came out most appealing, and which was accentuating the positives and eliminating the negatives, was having a charge point right outside your front door, right on your street. So let's go on to the next slide then. This is how we're helping Merton achieve that within their borough. So we're right in the middle of installing around 530 charge points in Merton and London. That will take the local charging infrastructure from about 250 charge points to nearly 800 charge points. And this is delivering a huge, a massive amount of infrastructure at incredibly good value for the public purse, and helping Merton make the most of the grants that they have available, as well as taking away all the stress. So there's no maintenance liability for the council, no risks on energy costs or utilisation risk. We're bearing all of that, and the council still gets a revenue share to help pay for other local services. And you can see from the map here, we've been quite targeted in where those charge points need to go, and you'll see different densities of charge points in different parts of the borough to help ensure that people who don't have driveways have more support than areas where driveways are fairly common. So if we look at the next slide, this is kind of how we've delivered that. So we will complete this project within 8 months of starting working with Merton once the contract was in place. And you can see that along the process, we have engaged the residents, given them notice of that sites where lampposts in their street were proposed to have charge points, and there's been a good dialogue with residents and the councils looking at those things. So that process has probably stretched out the installation thing as well, and we're right now in the middle of installing those 530 charge points, and should be finished by the end of April. So I think if we're worried about how long does charging infrastructure take to install, choosing the right type of infrastructure and retrofitting as much as we can not only makes things easier for your residents, it also helps us achieve really good coverage really quickly. So if we look at the next slide, we're sort of really finding our stride as a company. I think the whole market is hotting up, and you can see our progress in scaling our network is really ramping up. So while it took nearly 3 years for us to install our first 500 charge points, we've done the last 500 in just 4 weeks. I think that sort of momentum, as we work closer and closer with councils and people overcome their hesitancy for on-street charging, I think we can really hit the ground running and achieve the rate of installation that we need out to 2030. Right, so let's look at how do we make charging cheaper for people who don't have driveways. So end of last year, we were faced with a real dilemma, and that was the exorbitant cost of electricity, and what do we do to help our customers keep their charging affordable. So we looked at what was happening in the market, and if we look at the next slide, you'll see how some other charge point operators were responding to that. Everyone was putting up their prices. So we looked at some of the EV tariffs that some of the domestic suppliers offer, and decided to do something similar to what Octopus does. So offer an EV tariff where we split our rate into two, so that we could offer more cost-effective pricing for night charging and day charging. And if you look at the next slide, what you'll see here is we now have offer our customers 7 hours of much cheaper charging. So this is some of the cheapest public charging you'll find out there. So 29 pence a kilowatt hour, which is less than what we pay for our home electricity use under the energy price cap. And bear in mind, there's that 20% versus 5% VAT differential as well, all built into that. And then 65 pence for using our charge points for the rest of the day. So that sounds great in principle. Would it work for our customers? So we looked at 100,000, the most recent 100,000 charging events to see whether this fits with our customers' charging patterns. And if you look at the next slide, you'll see it kind of does. So we thought we'd set ourselves some targets of how can we help our customers run their charging for less than 10p a mile. And we made some assumptions. We looked at how people use our charge points, and we found that more than half of charging sessions are less than 20 kilowatt hours, which kind of makes sense when you think that roughly half the number of plug-in cars are plug-in hybrids with very small batteries, and people tend to top up their electric cars rather than run them all the way down. So against that sort of profile, we then looked at when do people plug in and unplug. And if you look at the next slide, you'll see that sort of charging behavior. So most people plug in towards the end of the day when they sort of arrive home from work or finish up for the day. So you see a peak plug-in kind of at the worst time for the energy grid. This is not when you want everyone to start charging, because demand is typically at its highest, especially in winter. And then everyone unplugs in the morning and heads off to work. So we thought our night saver tariff would fit very well with the way that people use our charge points now, as long as we can sort of encourage a bit more change. So if we look at the next slide, we asked our drivers, what do you think about this? Is this a good idea? Is it a bad idea? How's it going to change your charging? We've got a couple of stats just to share with you quickly before we sort of see how the guys have done in practice. So if you look at the next slide. So this was the view that we got before we launched the new service. The majority of people were in favor, especially if they were private drivers. So I think they would have found it easier to accommodate this form of charging. And then we looked at sort of why do you think it's a good idea or a bad idea? And if we go to the next slide, you'll see some of the comments that people posted. So by and large, people thought it was a good idea because they had saved money. It worked for their lifestyle. And I was surprised by the number of people who said this is also a good idea for the grid. It helps us use power when there's less demand on the grid. So that's pretty cool. And why did they think it was a bad idea? If we look at the next slide. Generally because they couldn't make it work around their lifestyle. So there might be shift workers who work during the night and would have to do most of their charging at home during the day. So we're going to need to work on that a little bit. And for lots of other people, they thought it was inconvenient. What we were asking them to do was to go out at midnight and plug their cars in. So we've got a little bit more education work to do on that, about how people can use the scheduling services within their features within their cars to plug in normally and then start charging later, let the car start charging later. So if we go into the next slide, did people think it would save them money? By and large, yes. A lot of people thought it'd be about the same, and some were worried that about a third of people were worried that it would end up costing them more money. And on to the next slide. And we asked them a bunch of questions around what they thought for their charging behavior. So would they plug in later? Lots of them said yes. Would they start using the scheduling apps? A fair number of people said they could. I think what we found was the taxi drivers that responded to the survey, because they use a lot more energy than everyone else, they'll need a lot more time plugged in. So probably less easy for them. And would it change their charging behavior? Would they do bigger charges or smaller charges more often? So if we go to the next slide. So we've and maybe the next one. So we've looked at 30,000 charging events and from December to February to see how people have responded in practice. So if we go into the next slide. And maybe the next one. So just comparing the old plug-in times versus the new ones. So what you can see here is there has been a massive spike in the number of people plugging in at just the hour before or the hour after midnight when the cheaper rate kicks in. And what that has done is reduce the amount of people who are plugging in at the peak time. So this is pretty good for the grid. And if we look at the plug-in plug-out times, also we've seen many more people shifting their unplugging. A more expensive rate kicks in. So if you price energy in the right way, people will respond and change their behavior. And if we go on to the next slide, and what we have done now is create a much more grid-friendly charging pattern. So fewer people are charging when there's lots of demand on the grid, and more people are shifting that energy consumption to the end. And last slide, if we go on to the next one. People are doing bigger charges by and large. And if we go into the next one, and are they saving money? I might have to end it there. So